The sound of my own heels on that porch was the first thing that scared me, because it meant I had actually come back, and standing there at 70 years old, leaning on his cane in the doorway of the house my father built with his bare hands, was the man who had signed my inheritance away while I was still crying at my father's funeral. 19 years I had waited for this moment, and now that it was here, I realized I hadn't come home to make peace. I had come to take back everything he stole. Before I tell you what happened on that porch, and everything that came after, I want to ask you something. If you believe in kindness, if you believe people can change, if you believe that forgiveness is one of the hardest and bravest things a human being can do, then please take a moment right now to like this video, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from, share it with someone who needs a little hope today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss a story like this one. Our community grows stronger every time someone new joins us looking for a little light, and I promise you, this story has plenty of it, even though it doesn't start that way. My name is Nora Ashford, and until I was 17 years old, I lived on 62 acres of orchard land in a small town called Millbrook Falls, where the apple trees my grandfather planted stretched all the way to the ridge behind our house, and where every autumn the whole town would come out for the harvest festival my father hosted for free, because he said an orchard that only fed one family wasn't worth owning. My father, Thomas Ashford, was the kind of man people trusted with their savings, their secrets, and their children, and when he died of a heart attack in the toolshed one August afternoon while I was at cheer practice, half the town showed up not because they had to, but because they loved him. I was 17. My mother had passed 3 years earlier from cancer, so when my father died, I had no one left in that house except my father's younger half-brother, Gerald Whitby, who had moved in 2 years before to, in his words, help manage the orchard books since my father trusted him with numbers. I did not know, standing at my father's grave in a black dress that still smelled like his aftershave from where I'd hugged his jacket the night before, that Gerald had already been to see a lawyer. I did not know that within 6 weeks, papers would be signed, some of them with my father's shaky signature from his final months when his heart medication made his hands tremble, transferring controlling ownership of Ashford Orchards into Gerald's name, citing my father's supposed wishes to protect the business for me until I turned 25. I did not know that Gerald would tell the town, and eventually tell me, that this was simply prudent, that a teenage girl couldn't run 62 acres, that he was doing what my father would have wanted. What I did know, at 17, grieving both my parents inside of 3 years, was that within 4 months, Gerald sat me down at the kitchen table where I had eaten breakfast every morning of my life, and told me that boarding school in Ohio had been arranged, fully paid for, and that it would be good for me to have a fresh start away from all these painful memories. I remember asking him, with my voice shaking, whether this was really what my father wanted, and I remember Gerald not quite meeting my eyes when he said yes. I was 17 and had just lost everyone I loved, and I did not have the strength or the legal standing to fight a grown man who controlled every document in that house. So I went to Ohio. I finished high school 2 states away from the only home I had ever known, and every letter I wrote asking to come back for the summer was met with a kind but firm response that the transition period wasn't over yet, that it was better for my emotional healing to stay focused on my studies. By the time I was 20, I had stopped asking. By the time I was 25, the age at which Gerald had promised the orchard would return to me, I received a single email informing me that due to complicated tax restructuring, ownership had been formally and permanently transferred, and that he hoped I understood it was for the best. I did not have money for a lawyer then. I had student loans and a studio apartment in Columbus and a job answering phones at an insurance office, and I had learned, the hard way, that grief makes you an easy person to take advantage of. But grief also has a strange way of turning into fuel if you let it sit long enough. I want you to imagine what it feels like to be 19 years old, working double shifts to pay for community college textbooks, while the man who pushed you out of your own home is being interviewed by the local paper about his stewardship of a beloved family orchard. I read that article on my lunch break in a break room that smelled like burnt coffee, and something in me went very quiet and very still. I decided, right there, that I would build a life so solid, so undeniable, that one day I would walk back into Millbrook Falls not as a grieving teenager anyone could dismiss, but as someone no one could ignore. It took me 11 years. I studied business at night while working full-time. I clawed my way into a junior analyst position at an agricultural investment firm in Chicago, because I told myself if I couldn't have my own orchard, I would understand orchards better than anyone who had one. I made mistakes. I dated men who didn't deserve me and worked for bosses who took credit for my ideas, and there were nights I cried into a pillow in an apartment I could barely afford, wondering if I was chasing a ghost. But by the time I was 32, I had my own small firm, 3 employees, and a specialty in helping family farms restructure debt and reclaim mismanaged assets. I had, without entirely meaning to, spent over a decade becoming exactly the kind of person who could walk into a courtroom and take Gerald Whitby apart. The final piece fell into place 8 months before I stood on that porch, when my father's old attorney, a soft-spoken man named Walter Higgins who was nearing retirement, tracked me down through a mutual contact and told me something that changed everything. He said that in cleaning out his old filing archives, he had discovered a box of documents related to my father's estate that had never been properly filed, documents that Gerald's lawyer at the time had apparently overlooked or deliberately buried, including an earlier will, signed by my father 2 years before his death, back when his hands were steady and his mind was completely clear, that left the orchard entirely to me, with Gerald named only as a temporary manager until I came of age. Explicitly barred from any transfer of ownership. Walter told me he had always had a bad feeling about how quickly things moved after my father's death, but he'd been a young associate at the firm back then and hadn't had the standing to push back. He was calling now, he said, because his conscience wouldn't let him retire without making it right. I did not cry when I read that document, though I thought I would. Instead, I felt something colder and more purposeful settle into my chest. I hired the best estate litigation attorney in Chicago, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Patricia Voss who had built her career untangling exactly this kind of quiet, small-town theft, and together we spent 6 months building a case so thorough that Gerald wouldn't have a single thread to pull on. I did not tell anyone in Millbrook Falls I was coming. I did not want a warning issued, a hasty deal struck, or evidence quietly disappeared. I wanted to walk up that porch with the truth already sitting in a folder under my arm, and I wanted to watch Gerald's face when he understood that the girl he sent away in disgrace had come back with the power to take it all back. That is who I was when I stood on that porch on a bright Tuesday morning in early October, the orchard behind the house heavy with fruit exactly the way I remembered it, the same white paint peeling in the same corner of the railing my father always meant to fix, and Gerald Whitby standing in the doorway looking 20 years older than the 61 he actually was, thinner, grayer, leaning hard on a wooden cane I had never seen him need before. For a moment neither of us said anything. I had rehearsed this moment so many times in my head, sharp opening lines, the exact tone of righteous calm I wanted to strike, and standing there in front of him, all of it evaporated, replaced by a strange, disorienting grief, because some small, stubborn part of me had been hoping, all these years, that he would look at me and immediately understand how badly he had failed me, and instead he simply looked tired, and old, and surprised. He said my name like a question, like he wasn't sure I was real, and I told him I wasn't there for a reunion. I told him I knew about the will. I watched something in his face crack, not into anger, which I had expected and prepared for, but into something closer to relief, which I had not prepared for at all, and he said, in a voice much smaller than I remembered, that he had been waiting 11 years for someone to finally make him answer for it. He invited me inside, and against every instinct honed by 11 years of careful planning, I went, because I told myself that walking through that door with my head held high, on my own terms, was its own kind of victory. The kitchen was exactly the same yellow curtains my mother had sewn, faded now to almost white, the same chip in the counter tile where I dropped a cast iron pan when I was 12. Gerald moved slowly to the stove and put on a kettle out of old habit, the way he always had when there was something difficult to discuss, and I sat at the table where he had once told me I was going to boarding school, and I let the silence stretch until he was ready to fill it. What he told me over the next hour was not the confession of a cartoonish villain twirling a mustache over stolen land. It was messier than that, and in some ways harder to hold. He told me that when my father died, he had been drowning in his own debts from a failed hardware store 2 towns over, debts he had never told my father about because he was ashamed, and that when he saw the orchard, profitable, beloved, entirely unprotected by a grieving teenager, something ugly and desperate in him had taken over. He said he told himself at first it was temporary, that he would stabilize things and hand it back, that sending me to boarding school really was, in some twisted way, an attempt to protect me from watching him struggle to keep the business afloat while he quietly used its profits to pay off his own creditors. He said that somewhere in those first 2 years, guilt calcified into justification, and justification calcified into a story he told himself so often he almost believed it, that I was better off, that the orchard was safer in his hands, that a young girl chasing a life in the city didn't need 62 acres of headaches. He told me, and his voice broke saying it, that the day the article came out praising his stewardship, he had gone into the toolshed where my father died and sat on the floor and cried, because he knew exactly what he was, and he did it anyway. I want to be honest with you, because that's the only way a story like this means anything. I did not forgive him in that kitchen. I felt no soft rush of understanding, no cinematic swell of sympathy. I felt 11 years of exhaustion and grief crystallize into a hard, clear anger, and I told him so. I told him about the nights I ate ramen noodles for dinner 3 times a week so I could afford my textbooks. I told him about crying in a break room over a newspaper article celebrating him. I told him that he hadn't just taken land, he had taken my last connection to my parents, the trees my grandfather planted, the porch my father built, the kitchen my mother cooked in, and that no amount of shame in a toolshed could hand back the years I spent feeling like an orphan with no one in the world who wanted her. He did not argue with a single word of it. He sat across from me with his hands wrapped around a cup of tea he never drank, and he let me say every furious thing I had been saving for 11 years, and when I finally ran out of words, he said the only thing that mattered, which was that I was right, and that he wasn't asking me to forgive him, only to let him finally tell the truth to whoever needed to hear it. Patricia Voss had told me, before I ever got on the plane, that I had every legal tool necessary to file suit immediately, freeze his assets, and likely recover full ownership of the orchard within 8 to 14 months, and that the earlier will combined with evidence of fraudulent transfer made this close to a guaranteed win. Sitting in that kitchen, I had every reason and every right to leave that morning and let my lawyer handle the rest through certified letters and court dates, never speaking to Gerald again except through legal representatives. Part of me wanted exactly that, wanted the clean, cold efficiency of it, wanted him to feel, in the most literal way, what it meant to lose everything he thought was permanently his. But something kept me sitting at that table past the point where anger alone would have carried me out the door, and I think, looking back, it was the sheer unexpectedness of his surrender. I had built an entire decade of my identity around the idea that I would have to fight him, that he would lie, minimize, hide behind lawyers of his own, and instead he was sitting there offering me the truth with both hands, asking for nothing in return except the chance to say it out loud. Over the following days, because I extended my stay in Millbrook Falls far longer than I had planned, I learned things about the last 11 years that complicated the tidy story I had been telling myself. I learned that Gerald had never remarried, never had children of his own, and had spent every autumn since my departure hosting the harvest festival my father started, not out of pride, people told me, but almost like a penance, standing at the edge of the crowd rather than the center of it, making sure the town's kids still got their free cider and their hayride even as his own health quietly declined from a heart condition eerily similar to the one that killed my father. I learned from Mrs. Delacroix, who ran the general store and had known my family for 30 years, that Gerald had, in fact, used a significant portion of the orchard's profits over the years not just to pay off his old debts but to fund scholarships for 2 local kids whose families couldn't afford college, kids he never told anyone he was helping, and that when the town's Little League team lost its sponsor 4 years ago, it was Gerald, anonymously, who kept it running. None of this erased what he had done to me. I want to be clear about that, because I don't believe good deeds done in secret can simply cancel out a great wrong done to someone who trusted you completely. But it did complicate him, turned him from a flat villain in my mind into something far more human and far more uncomfortable, a man capable of real theft and real generosity in the very same breath, a man who had spent over a decade quietly trying to be worthy of forgiveness he never expected to receive. The turning point, the moment that truly cracked something open in me, came 6 days into my visit, when Gerald's heart gave him trouble badly enough that I found myself driving him to the small regional hospital 40 minutes away because he refused, at first, to call an ambulance, insisting it would pass. It did not pass. I sat in a hard plastic chair in a hallway that smelled like antiseptic and old coffee, my folder of legal documents still sitting untouched in my rental car in the parking lot, and I realized I was terrified, not of losing my legal case, but of losing him before he had the chance to finish saying what he'd started saying in that kitchen. It surprised me how much that terrified me. I sat there for 3 hours while doctors ran tests, and in that time, I thought about my father dying alone in a toolshed while I was at cheer practice, and about how angry I still was, sometimes, that I never got to say goodbye properly, and I understood, sitting under those fluorescent lights, that whatever else Gerald was, he was the last living person who had known my father as a brother, who remembered the sound of his laugh and the particular way he used to hum while pruning trees, and that if I let him die with only anger between us, would be choosing, permanently, to lose that connection too. When the doctor finally told me Gerald was stable, that it had been a warning sign rather than a full crisis, but that his heart was weaker than it should be at his age and he needed rest and significantly less stress, I went in to see him, and he looked so small in that hospital bed, so unlike the man who had once seemed enormous and unmovable to a grieving 17-year-old, that something in my chest simply gave way. I did not tell him I forgave him. I want to be honest that forgiveness isn't a light switch, and anyone telling you it happens in one clean, dramatic moment is selling you something. But I sat down in the chair beside his bed, and I stayed. I stayed through the rest of that afternoon, and I came back the next morning, and instead of talking about lawsuits, we talked, haltingly at first, about my mother's garden, about the tree my father planted the day I was born, about the harvest festivals of my childhood, and somewhere in those quiet daytime hours in a small hospital room with sunlight coming through half-closed blinds, I started to understand that what I actually wanted wasn't merely to win. What I wanted, underneath 11 years of hardened resolve, was to feel like I had a family again, and Gerald, whatever his failures, was the only surviving link to that. I want to pause here and ask you something, because I think this is the heart of why I'm telling you this story at all. Have you ever had to choose between being right and being at peace? Because I had every right, every legal and moral justification, to take Gerald Whitby for everything he owned and never look back, and there were people in my life, including my own attorney, who gently suggested that softening toward him now, after everything, might be its own kind of naivety. But I want you to sit with this question as we go, because I think the answer matters more than you'd expect. What does it actually mean to take back what someone stole from you, when what they stole wasn't only land, but also years, and trust, and a sense of home? Can you ever fully get those things back through a courtroom, or does real restoration require something else entirely? Here is what I decided, sitting in that hospital room, watching a monitor trace the fragile rhythm of a heart that had once seemed indestructible to me. I decided that I still wanted the truth legally acknowledged, because the truth mattered, because my father's actual wishes mattered, and because letting a fraudulent transfer stand unchallenged would have been its own kind of dishonoring of his memory. But I decided I did not want to destroy Gerald in the process. I called Patricia from the hospital parking lot and told her I wanted to move forward with formally establishing my legal ownership of Ashford Orchards based on my father's original will, but that I did not want a punitive judgment, no clawback of every dollar Gerald had earned over 11 years, no public humiliation dragged through local papers. I wanted my name restored to the deed, my father's true wishes honored, and I wanted it done with as much dignity for everyone involved as the situation could hold. Patricia, to her credit, did not argue with me, though she made sure I understood exactly what I was choosing to leave on the table. I told her I understood, and that some things were worth more than what I was leaving behind. When Gerald was released from the hospital 4 days later, weaker but stable, doctors insisting he slow down significantly, I sat with him on that same porch where I had arrived so full of cold purpose, and I told him what I had decided. I watched him absorb it slowly, disbelief moving across his face like weather, and when I finished, he was quiet for a long time, looking out over the orchard rows that had been in our family for 3 generations. Then he said something I have thought about every single day since. He said that he had spent 11 years believing that if the truth ever came out, it would rightfully end in his ruin, and that some nights he had almost hoped for it, because ruin would have felt like justice, would have felt like finally paying the debt he owed. He said he never once imagined that the reckoning would look like a woman he'd wronged sitting beside him on a porch, choosing mercy not because he deserved it, but because she had decided, somewhere along the way, that mercy was who she wanted to be. He told me that was a harder thing to carry than punishment would have been, and a far better one. The legal process, once it moved forward with both of us in agreement rather than in opposition, took less time than anyone expected. Walter Higgins, the old attorney whose conscience had started this whole chain of events, personally walked the corrected paperwork through the county courthouse himself, practically giddy with the chance to fix a wrong he'd long carried guilt over. Within 10 weeks, the deed to Ashford Orchards was formally and permanently transferred back into my name. My father's original will fully honored at last, 11 years after it should have been. Gerald signed every document without a single objection, and when it was finished, he asked me, quietly, almost afraid of the answer, whether I wanted him to leave, whether there was a version of this where he simply disappeared from Millbrook Falls and let me rebuild my life without the daily reminder of what he'd done. I thought about that question for 3 full days before I answered him, because I owed myself an honest answer and not just a comfortable one. I thought about the version of my life where I sent him away and ran the orchard alone, technically victorious, legally vindicated, and completely isolated in a big empty house full of memories I'd have to face by myself. And I thought about the version where I let him stay, not as an owner, never again as an owner, but as family, imperfect and repentant and trying, the only person left alive who remembered my parents the way I did. I chose to let him stay. Not in the main house, but in the small caretaker's cottage at the edge of the property where my grandfather had lived out his final years, close enough to be part of my life, far enough that the boundary between us stayed clear and mine to hold. What grew between us over the following spring surprised both of us. I had come back to Millbrook Falls prepared for war, and instead I found myself, most mornings, walking the orchard rows with a 62-year-old man who had once betrayed me completely, learning from him the small, practical wisdom he had genuinely picked up over 11 years of running the place, which trees needed pruning first, how to read the soil before a frost, which buyers in the region actually paid fair prices and which ones tried to lowball struggling growers. I discovered that despite everything, he had kept the orchard alive and largely thriving, that beneath his theft was also, uncomfortably, real competence and real care, and I let myself hold both truths at once instead of demanding the world simplify itself into a story where he was only ever a villain. I also reconnected, almost by accident, with someone from my old life, a man named Caleb Whitmore, who had been 2 years ahead of me in school and whose family ran the neighboring dairy farm, and who I ran into at the county feed store during my second month back. Caleb had heard, as everyone in a small town eventually hears everything, the broad strokes of what had happened to me all those years ago, and rather than treating me like a scandal or a tragedy, he simply asked how I was doing, genuinely, and waited for a genuine answer. I want to be careful here, because I promised you at the start of this story that I did not come back for love, and that promise held true through everything I've told you so far. I did not go looking for Caleb, and finding him again was not the reason any of this mattered to me. But sometimes life hands you something you weren't hunting for anyway, quietly, without fanfare, and Caleb Whitmore, steady and unhurried and entirely unlike anyone who had ever tried to win me over with grand gestures, became someone I looked forward to seeing at the farmer's market on Saturday mornings, someone who helped me repair the porch railing my father had always meant to fix, someone who never once asked me to be anything other than exactly as guarded or as open as I needed to be on any given day. What grew between us grew slowly, the way real things tend to, rooted more in shared quiet mornings and mutual respect than in anything sweeping or sudden, and I share this with you not because it was the point of my journey, but because I think it matters that healing, when it's real, tends to make room for more life, not less, and love found me precisely because I had stopped chasing it and started simply trying to become whole. The Harvest Festival that October, the first one held under my ownership in 11 years, was the largest Millbrook Falls had seen in a decade. I stood at the edge of the orchard that morning watching families arrive with their children, watching Mrs. Delacroix set up her cider stand in the exact spot she'd used since I was a little girl, watching Gerald, walking with his cane but insisting on helping anyway, greet townspeople who had known him for years without knowing the full truth of what he'd done, and I felt something settle in my chest that I hadn't felt since I was 17 years old. Not triumph, though there was some of that. Something closer to belonging. I had spent 11 years building a life defined by what had been taken from me, and standing in that orchard, surrounded by the smell of ripe apples and wood smoke and the sound of children laughing on the same hayride my father used to drive, I understood that I had finally built something bigger than the theft that shaped me. I had built a homecoming. Before I tell you how this story ends, I want to ask you to do something for me, and I mean this sincerely, not as a formality. If any part of this touched something in you, if you've ever had to decide between righteous anger and hard-won peace, between what you're owed and who you want to become, I would love for you to leave a comment below telling me about a time you had to choose forgiveness even when you had every right to walk away instead. I read every single one, and I think there's something powerful in knowing we're not carrying these choices alone. Our community here has taught me so much through the stories you've shared in the comments of other videos, and I have a feeling this one is going to bring out some of the most meaningful reflections yet. Gerald Whitby passed away 18 months after that harvest festival, peacefully, in his sleep, in the small caretaker's cottage he had come to think of as exactly enough, on a quiet afternoon in early spring when the orchard was just beginning to bud. I was with him the week before he died, and in one of our last real conversations, sitting outside his cottage in the weak early sunlight, he told me that the years he'd spent back in my life, imperfect and quiet as they were, had been the best of his life. Better even than the years he'd spent as the sole owner of everything, because for the first time since my father died, he had stopped carrying his guilt alone. He told me that watching me run the orchard, watching me marry Caleb Whitmore that previous autumn under the same trees where I'd once played as a little girl, watching the harvest festivals grow bigger and happier each year, had let him believe, in the end, that some kinds of wrongs really can be set right, not erased, never erased, but genuinely set right. If the person you wronged decides that mercy is worth more to her than the satisfaction of watching you suffer for it. I buried him beside my father, at his own quiet request, in the small cemetery on the hill overlooking the orchard, and I did not hesitate when the caretaker asked whether that was really what I wanted. It was. Because somewhere in those 18 months, I had stopped seeing Gerald as the man who stole my inheritance and started seeing him as what he actually was, a deeply flawed person who had done something unforgivable and then spent the rest of his life trying, imperfectly but sincerely, to become someone worth forgiving anyway. I think that's the truest thing I can tell you about what happened to me. I did not come back to Millbrook Falls for love, and I did not come back looking for a family. I came back to take everything he stole from me, armed with a folder full of legal proof and 11 years of hardened resolve, ready to win. And I did win, in every legal sense that mattered. But what I actually walked away with, in the end, was so much larger than 62 acres of orchard land. I walked away having learned that the things people steal from us, our years, our trust, our sense of home, can sometimes be rebuilt in places we never expected, not by demanding the world pay us back in exact proportion to what we lost, but by choosing, deliberately and with open eyes, to build something new out of the wreckage anyway. Today, Ashford Orchards belongs fully to me and to Caleb, and to our daughter, born last spring, whom we named Helen after my mother, and every October the harvest festival my father started still fills the whole property with laughter and cider and the smell of wood smoke, exactly the way it did when I was a little girl who had no idea how much life was about to ask of her. I still think about that 17-year-old girl standing at her father's grave, not knowing that within 4 months she would lose her home too, and I wish I could tell her that the years ahead would be hard, harder than she could imagine, but that she would come out the other side not just whole, but larger than the wound that shaped her, capable of a mercy she couldn't yet imagine finding inside herself. If this story touched your heart even a little, I would be so grateful if you would like this video, leave a comment sharing your own thoughts or your own story of forgiveness, share it with someone in your life who might need a reminder that it's never too late to set something right, and subscribe to our channel so you're here with our family for the next story, because there is always another one, and I have a feeling some of you needed to hear this particular one today more than you realized. Thank you for sitting with me through all of it. I'll see you in the next story.